Welcome to AP Biology. This video is on ATP. ATP is the cell's usable energy source. It's going to be the energy source that fuels all cellular work. All cellular work falls within three categories: chemical, transport, or mechanical. Chemical work is going to be the formation of chemical bonds. Think about linking together amino acids to make a protein. This involves dehydration synthesis, and ATP is going to be the fuel source that drives that. The second type of work is transport work. In transport work, the energy in ATP is used to pump materials into or out of the cell. The final type of work is mechanical work. Mechanical work is the physical movement of materials within the cell. Here you see one example. In this example here we see a motor protein being used to physically move a vesicle within the cell. Another good example of mechanical work would be muscle contraction. All three of these forms of work are fueled using ATP, the cell's only usable energy source. What is ATP? ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. ATP is a modified nucleotide. In particular, it's a modified nucleotide of RNA. It's made up of a nitrogenous base, adenine. It's made up of a pentose sugar, ribose. A normal nucleotide only has one phosphate group, but what makes ATP different is that it contains three phosphate groups. And these three phosphate groups here, or you see them easier here, are where all the energy that ATP has is stored. These phosphate groups are extremely high energy. They're extremely reactive or unstable because each phosphate group has a negative charge. And when you place negative charges next to each other, they repel each other. So this ATP molecule is very unstable. It's very reactive and therefore very high in free energy. The energy in ATP is released when the terminal phosphate, that last phosphate group, is cut off. The process of cutting this bond involves hydrolysis, the addition of water. The terminal phosphate gets hydrolyzed. When the terminal phosphate is hydrolyzed, we have a massive release of energy, 7.3 kilocalories of energy. Equally as important as that energy that gets released is going to be this phosphate group. And we're going to see what that phosphate group does in a second. You can see that when ATP becomes hydrolyzed, it is converted into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate group. This reaction is an exergonic reaction, or it's a spontaneous process, because you have a high energy reactant being broken down into a low energy product, and we have a release of energy. So what happens to that phosphate group when it gets cleaved off of ATP? That phosphate group is going to bind to one of the reactants in the chemical reaction. When that takes place, the reactant becomes what we call a phosphorylated intermediate. We're going to see how that phosphorylated intermediate forms and what it actually does. I think of phosphorylation like activation. When a phosphate group is attached to a reactant, it's like turning on the on switch, and it's the trigger that's going to cause that chemical reaction to take place. Physically, that phosphate group is extremely high energy. It's very reactive. It's very unstable. So when the phosphate group attaches itself to a reactant, that reactant in turn becomes more unstable, and that's what leads to the chemical reaction taking place. Here you see an example. In this example here we have an endergonic reaction. You have the addition of glutamic acid and ammonia to form glutamine. This endergonic reaction requires 3.4 kilocalories of energy to take place. ATP is going to be the fuel source that drives this endergonic reaction. When ATP is hydrolyzed, you can see here that it releases 7.3 kilocalories of energy. And that energy released is going to be the fuel source that drives this chemical reaction, that powers this chemical reaction. When the ATP gets hydrolyzed, you also see the phosphate group attach itself to a reactant. In this case, it's glutamic acid. That reactant becomes the phosphorylated intermediate. This phosphorylated intermediate is more unstable, and that's the trigger that actually causes this chemical reaction to take place, combining the two reactants and forming the product glutamine. So you can see that these two reactions are linked together, or technically we would call them coupled. We have an exergonic reaction coupled to an endergonic reaction. The exergonic reaction is the hydrolysis of ATP. This exergonic reaction is going to be linked to the endergonic reaction, linking these two reactants together. The energy in the phosphate group released through the hydrolysis of ATP is going to fuel all endergonic processes that take place within the cell. In other words, the hydrolysis of ATP is going to fuel all cellular work that takes place. Now, ATP is like a battery, and your body doesn't actively need to produce new ATP. Instead, ATP is going to be regenerated over and over again. It's a cyclic process. We know that the hydrolysis of ATP, which is an exergonic reaction, is going to fuel all types of cellular work. Whether that cellular work is going to be chemical work, whether it's going to be transport work, or whether it's going to be mechanical work. When ATP gets hydrolyzed, it releases its energy and it becomes ADP and the phosphate. Now, where does the energy come from to link this phosphate group back onto the ADP to regenerate ATP? The answer is from your food, right? This is why we need to consume food. Food is going to enter a process called cell respiration. During cell respiration, energy is extracted from your food. And the energy extracted from your food is going to be the energy utilized to add this phosphate group back onto ADP and to regenerate ATP. This is the whole point of this catabolic pathway that we call cell respiration. When you break down food, the energy released from your food is not used to power cell work. Instead, the energy released from your food is used to regenerate ATP. It's used to take that phosphate group, add it back onto ADP, and to remake the ATP. The ATP is then going to be the energy source that actually fuels all cellular work. This concludes this video.